Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Groundshots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. It's the same to you, all of Hey y'all, it's Kelly. Welcome to the Groundshots podcast. I am currently recording this at sunset on a mesa above the Gila River in southern New Mexico. It's such a gorgeous view. It's like a 360 view I have right now, and the clouds are creating such a wonderful pattern of light and dark on the hills, which are covered in California poppies right now and other beautiful wildflowers. Been hanging out up here for a couple days and really taking in this beautiful place in isolation with Gabe, and we've been looking at the plants and taking it easy. I've been working on the podcast. We actually have a little cell service up here, so I've been able to get a couple things done that I wouldn't normally. I hope everybody out there is hanging in there, and I hope you've been enjoying the last few new episodes of the podcast. I've been doing more online interviews with folks I've been wanting to interview for a while, but I kind of waited out to see if somehow it'll happen in person. But this is a good opportunity for me to go ahead and just do the interviews and talk to folks online and have really sweet conversations. So the coming months, I'm going to be doing more of those and airing more of those, so I look forward to sharing those with you. This episode of the podcast features a conversation with Zach Elfers, which was recorded a few weeks ago via Skype, and I met Zach a couple years ago in California after being online friends for a while, and we would share info about plants through that platform. So I'm really excited to share some of his perspective and work with you and give you a little bit of insight about him. He's an ethnobotanist, and he lives in eastern Pennsylvania near the Susquehanna River, and it's one of the oldest rivers in the world. And he runs a project called Nomad Seed. He talks about that river and the Nomad Seed Project in this conversation, and it's pretty fascinating. On his website, he describes the Nomad Seed Project, which he runs, as a project that sets out to research, document, experiment, and propagate wild, native, and perennial plants, which have exceptional value to humans and their ecology as food, medicine, shelter, materials, and beauty. I'm going to go ahead and read the rest of the description that he has on his website about Nomad Seed because I think it's beautifully written, and this is a pretty long interview and conversation that's really insightful and educational, so this will give you kind of a introduction to the way that he thinks and the way that he's connected to plants. Imagining the world of nomadic gatherer-hunters invokes to mind a patchwork landscape with oases of human habitat along pathways of migration unfolding with the pattern of the seasons, plants, or animals. For thousands of years, humans lived in this manner, and along the way they gathered useful plants and intentionally spread the seeds as a form of populations management. Ecology has been a co-creation alongside humankind for a long time. Humans often acted as the legs of important plants, expanding them both in their range and abundance. It was humans who brought the pawpaw out of the subtropics after the last ice age and spread it around the eastern temperate forests, and it was humans who also spread the sunroot, or Jerusalem artichoke, throughout the continent. Nomad Seed Project is interested in ideas of assisted migration, especially in response to climate change and as a way to protect and conserve species in the face of a rapidly changing world. The Nomad Seed Project is a revisioning of this old paradigm. By gathering and planting the seeds of native, wild, perennial plants that are important to us, we as humans have the power to impact the ecosystems we are a part of in a positive and healthy way, while also meeting our own requirements for food, shelter, medicine, and materials. Neither agriculture, gardening, nor preservationism, but something in between. It may be a long time, however, before we can fully sustain ourselves again from the wild plants growing in nature's garden. While prior to colonialism, the presence and abundance of plant foods and medicines were much greater, our ecosystems today have been degraded, fractured, or destroyed in the wake of farming, ranching, mining, urban development, suburban sprawl, and the highway system. Now it's more important than ever that we act again as the legs to the plants that we love, helping them gain new ground ahead of mass extinction and climate change. The Nomad Seed Project describes work that could also be called do-it-yourself ecological restoration at the hands of citizen scientists acting according to their own conscience. By working with these native plants, with the same stroke we expand our own habitat. There's a lot of work to do, but it all starts with the power of a seed. So that's the gist of Zach's project, and you can see that some of the episodes we've put out in the last few months on wild tending and rethinking invasive plants, and Calibri's conversation about questioning farming practices and his work with wild tending and studying wild tending. I feel like a lot of these are building on each other, and this episode is doing that as well. Zach is based in Pennsylvania, but he spent a lot of time in the West, traveling around, camping out with the plants, as he'll explain in this interview a little bit of his story. And he's also spent a lot of time in the Midwest and the Southeast, so his knowledge is pretty huge, and he pieces together a lot of history and firsthand records, as well as his own investigations in the field to come up with knowledge that we don't really know exactly how some things were done on the East Coast, especially because of how long colonization has been going on. Much of that is lost or barely remnant, and the land looks really different too. It definitely takes an investigative, curious mind to piece it all back together, and that's what Zach does. I really don't know if there's anyone else doing it exactly the same way that he is, so I really feel like this conversation is a gem. It's like just a one tiny piece of what Zach knows and what he's been thinking about and putting together over the years. So I really think that you'll find that this conversation is probably like nothing else you've ever heard. I'm really excited to share it with you, and I hope that we'll maybe do another conversation again, because there's only a few plants we really got to touch on in this conversation with Zach, and he has done a lot of work with other plants that we barely even talk about. To give you a little overview about what exactly we talk about in this conversation with Zach Elfers. Zach speaks a little bit on the natural and ethnobotanical history of the Susquehanna River near where he lives. And he speaks on his project Nomad Seed, which I just described to you. We talk about Zach's experience learning plants while traveling and being out on the land, and how this helped deepen his understanding of his home ecosystem in Pennsylvania. We talk about specific wild foods or first food plants that Zach tends and his methods for doing so. And we talk about plants like spring beauty, dwarf ginseng, toothwort, American groundnut, harbinger of spring, eastern camas, chestnuts, hickories, chinkapins, and more. We talk a little bit about fire stick farming and how it may have been a wild tending practice in the southeastern U.S. We speak on the importance of John Hershey's farm in Pennsylvania for preserving native fruit and nut species that were possibly bred at one point by indigenous peoples, and Zach's research on how he thinks this happened. We talk about the importance of prioritizing the preservation and propagation of bioregional foods. We talk about Zach's experiments with and research on controlled burn gardens on the East Coast. We talk about different ways one can define agriculture, an ongoing topic here in the podcast. We talk about ethical foraging and how learning the plant's entire life cycles, encouraging them to become more abundant by working with the plants all year, is the best way to do that. And at the end, we get into talking about the pandemic and just where we're all at with it. And Zach has some really wise words in relationship to that. So we talk about choosing love over fear in a time of collapse. Since this is a longer episode, I'm going to go ahead and send y'all off to the rest of the conversation. The sun is literally setting behind the mountain right now. It's pretty awesome. And yeah, I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Zach and gain something insightful from it. And I hope it inspires you to go collect seeds and watch the plants all year. Learn that you can help them. I hope this inspires you. And so happy listening, y'all.
Burn, burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn, burn with the heat that will warm the
can start by maybe giving us a little bit of a picture of where you are and also introduce us to your project Nomad Seed, which I know is a ever shifting work that you're doing. But maybe start with that and then we'll move from there into some more specific topics and projects related to your work.
Sure. Well, right now I am along the lower Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. I'm from around this area originally, and I still have a lot of friends and community and kind of support groups around this region. It's about getting in towards the later side of March. But anyway, one of the things that I think is really special about this place, and there's many things I think are special about this place, but one of the biggest things is that the Susquehanna River is one of the oldest rivers in the world. There are 3 Appalachian rivers that are older than all of the mountain building events that rose up around them, and those are the Susquehanna River, the French Broad River, and the New River. So it's kind of an open-ended question which of the 3 is older, but a lot of geologists believe that the Susquehanna is the oldest of the 3. And on the global scale, that would make the Susquehanna River the 3rd oldest in the world. She's very long. She begins in the Finger Lakes region, Lake Otsego, and then flows through New York, through Pennsylvania, into Maryland, and then becomes the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is actually the engorged estuary of the Susquehanna River. There's a lot of interesting geology around here. Down at the mouth of the Susquehanna River, just before the bay, there's an extinct volcano. And here we are the northern edge of the southeast. So as far as the flora and the fauna goes, we have we're considered the southeast. A lot of people hear Pennsylvania and they think northeast, but this particular region is southeast. So we've got lots of pawpaw, lots of persimmon, lots of wildflower diversity, oak hickory forests, things like that. And the Susquehanna River is pretty special. There's a lot of rocky bedrock islands along this lower portion of the river. And unfortunately, there's 3 or 4 dams as well. So hundreds of years ago, there used to be Atlantic salmon and shad that would run in the millions all up and down this river. And that doesn't happen anymore. So there's a lot of grief and heartache in this land, as I'm sure the people know, this grief elsewhere. It's all over. But here along the lower Susquehanna River, it's very developed in the uplands. It's mostly agricultural, a lot of cornfields and things like that. But as you get down to the river, it's a gorge. So there's a lot of very rocky hillsides, a lot of waterfalls, ravines, hollows. We have, it's very beautiful, but because it's so rocky and craggy, it never got developed. So there's hundreds of miles of wildland on both sides of the river that, whether it's publicly owned and protected or not, it's dense forests. We've got the Mason-Dixon Trail, which runs from to the Appalachian Trail and runs along the river for a ways. We have it's basically a nice little spot, and there's a lot of interesting activity. There's a helicopter flying overhead right now.
I can hear it a little bit.
Yeah.
Not quite a bird.
It's been quiet most of the time because of this coronavirus situation. There's been times where there hasn't been a car on the road, there hasn't been a plane in the sky.
Wow.
So it's interesting. They're flying over. But yeah, anyway, there's some remnant indigenous gardens around here too, with a lot of Apios Americana and Harbinger of Spring, pawpaw, and other other native foods of this region. And I can talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
So my project is the Nomad Seed Project. I think I began it around 2016, and it is pretty dynamic, changing project. I haven't released any writings in about a year now, but I have a big backlog of material that I've been working with. And basically, the Nomad Seed Project is a close look at a lot of our native food plants, especially the ones that have ethnobotanical history, but also the ones that there's not much written about. And so it's kind of like an experimental investigation into things like spring beauty roots and harbinger of spring, um, Apios Americana, the American groundnut, toothwort, and trillium and ramps. And the perspective that I've taken through the project is as a propagator. So in my life, I've been fortunate to basically learn the horticulture trade, quote unquote, through a few really good mentors who taught me basically all about how to propagate native plants. And these were primarily nursery people, but I came into this world basically with as a forager with an interest in permaculture and agroforestry. And one of my mentors had a food forest that was based around pawpaws and chestnuts and things like that, and ran like a little native plant and permaculture nursery. And as I learned the tools or the tricks of how to propagate these plants and basically got to live in close with their life cycle, it was a really profound realization to understand that on the one hand, there were all these wild foods that people like to forage that I liked to eat and consume. And in the other hand, I knew how to propagate them and I knew how to make their populations bigger and basically work with those plants. And so when I put those hands together, it was very profound for me. I spent a few years traveling. I went out west. I went all over the Midwest too, in the South, and I had a lot of really amazing experiences out there, especially just learning plants in the field. I would study everything that I could, and, try to really hone my botanical ID skills, but also just seeing ecosystems and living and camping among them was really eye-opening and just a really great way to learn, to just have that presence with these places. Um, and when I was out west, I made contact with Benicio Medrano, who is a mutual associate of ours, and that was pretty eye-opening to basically be introduced to how a lot of systems could have been tended and managed out in the Great Basin and the western bioregions. So that kind of kindled a fire in me. That catalyzed something, and being essentially a hill person from the Piedmont and the Appalachian regions, I wanted to come home and um, do all of these things in my home area. And so I did. And so I've been learning the plants and studying in the ways that I can and trying to learn from others. And most importantly, I think listening to the land and actually just spending time with her and seeing how things are and seeing what my role can be in that and how I can integrate in a healthy and balanced way. Not trying to control too much and not trying to um, not reciprocate. In other words, yeah. So
Cool.
so that's the project in a nutshell. I don't know if that was very very direct. It was kind of a
That was
rambling, meandering.
That was great. Yeah, I appreciate what you said about like when you travel and you camp out on the land and you're with the land, you really, just by being there and out in it, you learn from it. And I feel like that's been a shared thing for me too, like living nomadically or semi nomadically for a few years now. Like I've learned so much about the land just like being out on it. And when you're in different areas, you start to connect things together in a way that is different than if you just stayed in one place. And I think you have that perspective as well, like traveling all over the West and the Midwest and the South, and now you're in Pennsylvania, but like all of the perspective that you got in those places can feed what you're doing there because you can see the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All the knowledge just, for me anyway, it seems to just build off of itself. And I can take what I've learned in one bioregion and go into another bioregion. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brushstroke, but I really feel like um, there's a lot that can be illuminated,
Mm-hmm.
just by having that background knowledge, that basic level of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is something to be said about staying somewhere and really honing in, but I've been trying to figure out how to explain to people like the importance too of kind of seeing outside of what the box of a bioregion supposedly is, and like uh and getting perspective elsewhere and bringing it back to where you are. It's not so there's not like a clear line, even where you are, you're like, well, it's kind of the southeast, it's kind of the north, it's got some aspects of the north, like it's a bioregion, but it's not clearly defined. Everything has fluid lines and boundaries, and I think in relationship to wild tending and human interaction with the land historically, like those lines were always moving and blurred, too. So.
Hmm. But yeah, the land doesn't know the boundaries that we've put on her. She is, it's all fluid and it's all flowing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I usually think in terms of watersheds.
Mm.
So I'll think in terms of a particular creek system, and then um, going up in the uplands, it can be very different. And then you've got a whole anyway. there's so many different aspects to every ecosystem. It's all so unique, but it's all just flowing and
Mm-hmm.
melding from one aspect into another.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we could get into talking about wild tending. That's something on the podcast I've started to kind of explore a little bit with different folks, from the perspective of where they are, where they're working from. And so maybe you could get into your thoughts and feelings and ideas about wild tending and traditional ecological knowledge. And yeah, we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, I don't want to get too philosophical at the outset, so I think I'm going to start by just talking about the actual plants that I would be working with
Mm-hmm.
and what my experience is. And here, like I said, we're kind of we're past the middle of March, but almost to the later later end of March, and we've had a really early spring this year. So we have the Mertensia virginica, the bluebells. They're just starting to break their flowers, which is really wonderful. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. We've been at least 2 weeks ahead of schedule from most springs, but now that spring is here, we've got this big bloom of what are called the spring ephemeral plants, and these are plants that um, basically bloom in the woodland understory before the leaves grow in a temperate region. And after the leaves come in, there's too much shade, so the plants go dormant, and then they wait until the following spring. So a lot of these spring ephemeral plants have big roots and tubers, corms, bulbs, things like that, which are underground storage for all of that time when they'll be dormant. Um, the spring ephemerals are also really well adapted for growing through heavy leaf mulch and things like that, because they have all the stored energy reserves, so they can just push their shoots right up through the litter of leaves and pine stuff, and whatever they might encounter. Um, and a lot of these spring ephemerals are really fantastic wild foods. and I probably should avoid using the word wild because we can get into that. But one of these foods that's becoming very abundant at the moment is spring beauty, which is the genus Claytonia. Here in Pennsylvania, we have, at least in this area, we have mostly Claytonia virginica, but there's some Claytonia caroliniana, which is around, and those can be basically distinguished by Virginiana has slender leaves, and the tubers are covered in like a brown skin. The caroliniana has wide leaves, almost rounded, like a miner's lettuce, if you're familiar with that. They're cousins, botanically, taxonomically. And then the Claytonia caroliniana has kind of a purplish covering on the roots. But these roots can be pretty small, ranging from the size of a pea all the way up to the size of my fist. And how you know what size the root is from the foliage above ground is a bit of an art and an experience of just seeing this plant in so many different habitats. So generally where they get a lot of moisture or where they have really rich soil or really good conditions, they can just really explode in size. And so the bigger the tuber is, the more little leaflets they'll send up above the ground. So sometimes you're walking along and you see a big cluster of leaflets coming out. And so I'll just take a digging stick and pluck that root out of the ground. And it's like a potato. It's very nutritious, just loaded with starch. And just like a potato, that's a food that we can exclusively subsist off of if we need to. And spring beauty is no different. The flavor's pretty good. And then the greens are very much like miner's lettuce. And so I'll just take the whole plant, wash the dirt off of it, and boil it with the foliage and everything, and put a little salt in there. And then the greens are like salted kale, and then you have boiled potato as the root, basically. And that's a meal right there. Now, really, what we want to do is we want to wait until the spring beauty is ready to ripen its seed. And these are really small. They're black, and as the seed pods ripen, they collapse and they basically shatter, and it flicks the seeds out in every direction for a few feet. So it's not the kind of seed that we can really readily collect and just like keep in our pocket and sow, but you can. What I do is I just take the foliage right before it's about to release its seed and throw it in a paper bag, let it explode and do its thing, and then I can pour the seed out later. But what's easier for me is to just wait until those plants are almost ready to ripen their seed and then dig them. And then that tillage, that hole that you've left behind in the soil, basically creates the ideal conditions for the next generation of seeds to germinate. And another thing that really helps tubers get big is fire. Because when a fire comes through an area, you get a lot of biochar and ash that's created. Biochar has a pH that's 8.0, and so does ash. So it actually neutralizes the soil. So if you picture like the typical acidic woodland soils, where it can be 4.5, 5.5, or something like that, the biochar will actually moderate the soil pH. And what that really means is that calcium becomes more bioavailable. Calcium is always there in the soil, but it can't always be accessed by plants. But with the moderative effects of the biochar, calcium becomes more available, and calcium helps root development and it helps fruiting. So basically, you get bigger roots, you get more nutritious, sweeter fruits, and things like that. And so this foundation of using a digging stick to dig a root, and you're using some tillage, you're putting some tillage on the land so that the seeds can come into that space and germinate. And then the use of fire, we've just established fire stick farming, which is probably the most ancient, definitively human subsistence strategy there is in the world. We've been doing it for at least 100,000 years, all over the world, wherever we've gone. Fire stick farming is actually most closely associated with the Australian Aboriginal cultures, but that element that I just laid out is all over the world. And so I've only really talked about one plant so far, but another one that's really coming into abundance right soon is dwarf ginseng, which
Mm.
is Panax trifolius. So a lot of people have heard of its bigger sibling, the American ginseng, which is quinquefolius, which means 5 leaves. Trifolius means 3 leaves, but it actually has 5 leaves. It just has 3 leaves that are opposing each other. So dwarf ginseng is really delicious. They make little roots that are usually about the size of a marble, but they can be up to about a quarter in like the diameter of a quarter, and they're almost perfectly round. They're really crisp and sweet and delicious if you eat them raw, but then you can fry them up, and they're better than any French fries you've ever had. These are the roots that I'm eating, of course, but the foliage is also edible. There's actually been some interesting herbal work that's been done on the foliage of dwarf ginseng, which suggests that there's more ginsenosides in the foliage of dwarf ginseng than there is in the root of American ginseng. So,
Hmm.
by eating the leaves, I like to think that I'm getting some medicinal benefit, that adaptogenic medicine. Um, the leaves kind of have a pungency to them, so they definitely taste medicinal. It's not necessarily the kind of thing you might want to make a whole salad out of, but I really enjoy the flavor, and I know other people do too. So that's 2 root foods, and then there's also things like trout lily, which I don't really eat much of. Toothwort, that's a really wonderful plant that's coming out now. And the cool thing about toothwort is that it has these little they're these little white roots that look just like teeth, and they grow in a chain underground.
Hmm.
And in the early spring, when the leaves first come out of the ground, you can dig down where they are, and there will be a little white root with root hairs on it that's growing this year's plant. And then connected to it, there will be a chain of roots, and those are yellow. They're not going to grow this year. So, what you can do is you can take all of those yellow ones, you can leave the white one that's actively growing in the ground, and then that plant has not been killed. It'll keep growing and doing its thing and reproducing vegetatively. And if you get the toothwort just as the leaves are emerging in the spring, those roots are sweet. If you wait, even a few days late, they become really pungent. Like what's that thing you have on sushi?
Wasabi, right?
Wasabi. Yes, exactly. They taste just like wasabi.
That's a brassica,
Um,
right? It has some of that.
yes, yeah. It's cardomini is the genus, and there's a few different species of that, but around here it's mostly Laciniata. I think it's Laciniata or maybe Concatenata. Anyway, the narrow leaf toothwort or cut leaf toothwort. Um, there's also a broadleaf toothwort that's also fairly abundant around here. Um, Ethnobotanically, I was reading a really interesting account where some of the people of this turtle island would take these roots and they would ferment them, or what they it was called fermentation. They would basically leave it in the sun under cover, so like cover with a cloth or a basket or something, and leave it in the sun for 4 or 5 days, and then that was considered a fermentation, and then they would consume it. Um, and I think that fermentation does break down some of the wasabi flavor, makes the roots a little bit sweeter. But toothwort has an interesting effect psychosomatically. It really kind of brings you into a kind of clarity or presence. So it's almost like a nice ritual plant to consume in the spring. Um, and then there's a lot of other plants. I mean, I could just go on, but I think one of the most important ones to mention is the groundnut, the American groundnut, Apios americana, which there's some big patches of that still remaining along the river here. And those roots can get to be pretty big. I mean, they can get to be the size of a softball, maybe a little bit bigger. And similar to toothwort, they'll grow on a chain underground, like sausage links. And they have 3 times the protein that a potato does. And when you cook them up, they have a very peanutty flavor because they're in that legume family. the Fabaceae, and the legumes are where peanuts are placed as well. So what I do is I'll boil the ground nuts, and then once they're cooked through boiling, I'll just squeeze them out of their skins and fry them a little bit and kind of mash them just like mashed potatoes, and they taste just like peanut butter. It's unreal. Um, and groundnut is another one of these plants that really responds well to fire. So my friend Yana Fishman, down in North Carolina, I don't know if do you know her and Doug?
Doug Elliott?
Yes.
Yeah, I do. It's been a while since I've seen them, but yeah, I do. Yeah.
So Yana grew some grows groundnut in her garden, and last year she was telling me she had these kind of ragged looking tubers that were just extra. She had planted out her garden, and she didn't really have a place for these tubers, but she didn't have the heart to throw them out. So over by where their old burn pit was, they used to have brush piles in the corner of their land for many years. So over there, she turned it into a garden. She planted ube yam, which is this purple yam from, I think, Asia. And then she put in these raggedy looking small tubers of Apios. She said that in one season, they grew to be 6 inches in diameter.
Wow.
And so they just really loved all of this soil that was amended with charcoal. And I've done a lot of research on Apios Americana, going back to old timer records, early pioneer accounts, colonial accounts, and things like that. I wrote an article about it on my Nomad Seed website. But basically, Apios Americana, from what I can gather, used to be all throughout the prairies and the meadows all over the east, as far north as Maine and Canada, as far south as Florida, and as far west as Montana. And these meadows were kept open through fire. And today we think of Apios americana as more of a bottomland species that grows only like just along the waterways and in the edges of fens and wetlands and things like that. But Apios actually prefers a well-draining soil. It grows way better if you put it in an upland setting on rich, well-draining soil.
It's probably in those areas because that's where it has to be now, I guess.
Exactly. Those are the only areas where there's enough sunlight for it, right? So there was this early botanist named Frederick Persch who, I think from 1805 to like 1807 or something like that, very early in American history, he walked like 3,000 miles a year from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas and back with just a shotgun and his dog, and did botanizing. And when he wrote about Apios americana, he said it was abundant in mountain meadows and bottomlands from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. Now, that's hard for us to fathom today because most people can't imagine Apios americana growing in upland settings, much less mountain meadows. And that's really a legacy of the indigenous people that helped co-create this landscape to be what it was. There's a lot of other foods that are available this time of year. Harbinger of spring is one of my favorite plants. I have a deep love for that being. And again, it's another root food. It's in the carrot family, and it's similar to dwarf ginseng in its size and its flavor. It's amazing when it's roasted. The leaves are like parsley. Like I said, it's in that parsley carrot family, and it makes these little seeds that ripen just about 4 weeks after the plant emerges out of the ground, and it's one of our earliest blooming wildflowers. And if you find it in a good location, it can be very thick. It makes a colony all over the ground. So there's a place here along the lower river where there's acres and acres of it, just growing so thickly, and it's growing at the base of this, basically at the base of this cliff. And so there's been all this alluvial soil that's washed down over the ages. And we know that alluvial soil is very rich, But what's interesting about this place is that the soil is black. It's like charcoal black, even like 2-3 feet down. And it's so loose and friable that when I walk on it, it like quakes. And this ground is completely covered with harbinger of spring, which here in Pennsylvania is a disjunct. This plant is actually more abundant in the Midwest, especially the Ohio River Valley. So one of the things that I've done is kind of really tapped into the archaeology and the anthropology of this region, and I basically determined that Erigenia bulbosa was brought here by what we call the Shanks Ferry culture, who settled in this valley possibly as early as only 1000 AD, but maybe earlier. They seem to have been replaced by the Susquehannock people, who were considered Iroquois or loosely affiliated with the Haudenosaunee. That whole relationship is ambiguous as well. But anyway, the Shanks Ferry culture has a lot of similarities with the people who lived along the upper Potomac River in the Virginia Piedmont and the Maryland Piedmont. And there's this string of harbinger of spring all along the Potomac River.
Wow.
And that the harbinger of spring actually, it doesn't actually cross over the mountains, but there's a low point in the mountains there, roughly along the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. And just on the other side of the mountains, the harbinger of spring continues on again right into the Ohio River Valley. So if we rewind the clock and we return to these old-timer accounts, these early colonial accounts of this region, they talk about all of York County, Pennsylvania being prairie, with forests being just little ribbons right along the waterways and down in the hollers and the deep ravines and things. And this prairie continued through the Maryland Piedmont around the Baltimore area, and then it continued along the Potomac River watershed and the whole Greater Valley that basically makes the northern tip of the Blue Ridge Mountains a little island. So this would be like the Greater Valley runs through like Franklin County, Pennsylvania, Adams County, York County, Lancaster County, into Chester County and over towards the Delaware River watershed. This whole region was a lot of savanna. And that savanna continued down into the Shenandoah Valley. So the Shenandoah Valley was a prairie 1,000 miles long. That's what the old-timer accounts say, and they say that all throughout the meadows, the wild pea vine grew. And pea vine is an old-timer name for Apios Americana, the groundnut that I mentioned. In fact, here on the lower Susquehanna River, there's an island here called Peavine Island, which still has groundnut on it today. Wow. But the ecology has really changed because fire suppression and all kinds of things. They made a series of locks here on the river because it's a non-navigable river. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to, a 100 years ago or whatever, they wanted to have commerce on the river, and so they made this series of locks on the west side of the river. And so they did a lot of disturbance because of that. So some of these ancestral gardens were destroyed in that process, but there's still some remains. Like I said, the groundnut still grows there. But yeah, there's also some petroglyphs here in the river.
Oh, really?
And yeah, these petroglyphs are on a little rocky island made of granite. There's hardly any other granite around in the region. This is mostly like Wissahickon schist and sandstone and some limestone and a lot of like meta sandstone and meta limestone, stuff that's metamorphosed quite a bit. But yeah, there's this granite rock in the middle of the river, just below the Safe Harbor Dam. There's actually like probably a complex of 7 rocky islands that still have petroglyphs, but prior to the dams, there were a lot more. There was stuff on Baldfriar Rock, on Walnut Island, and whatnot. But today, the petroglyphs that are still there have images of serpents and thunderbirds, bison tracks, heron tracks.
Wow.
There's an image of the Pleiades, that star cluster in the heavens. There's concentric circles like spirals. Um, all kinds of interesting things, but there's also some solar alignments. These alignments orient towards true north.
Hmm.
They also orient towards the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And this region is usually known as an Algonquian language cultural family region. And these kinds of solar alignments aren't really common culturally, from what I understand, among Algonquian peoples, but they were common among the Siouan-speaking peoples, who the Lakota and the Dakota and the Nakota are Siouan-speaking peoples. So the peoples who were here, the Shanks Ferry culture, I believe, were Siouan-speaking, coming out of the Ohio River Valley, which is also the homeland of the Lakota. They began as woodland people, and then were basically either pushed or just migrated on their own further west out onto the prairie and became the Buffalo people. So we have this common cultural legacy that's still very much alive in the landscape here. Like I said, this harbinger of spring plant was brought by these people here. And I could go on about the evidence that I've compiled as to why I think this is the story. The story that I'm telling is a true story. In other words, really interestingly, there is or was a big patch of harbinger of spring in Broome County, New York, which is where modern day Binghamton is. And there was an early botanist who described it there on the west side of the river, which today is exactly where Atsaningo is. So Atsaningo is a Haudenosaunee word. It's also where we get the word Chenango, which is one of the branches of the Susquehanna River there. And there at Atsaningo, there was a Native American settlement for many years, and that region was known as the Southern Door. So during the period of early colonization in the 1700s, as a lot of the indigenous down in the Virginia Piedmont, the Maryland Piedmont, North Carolina Piedmont, and the Pennsylvania Piedmont were basically being genocided and pushed away by the European colonizers, the Cayuga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy opened their doors to these refugee tribes from the south. So that was known as the Southern Door. And Atsaningo was one of the first stages of the Southern Door. So what's really fascinating to me is that there was one of the last Tutelo speakers. So Tutelo is one of these Eastern Siouan-speaking languages of the Virginia Piedmont. One of the last Siouan-speaking speakers was a Tutelo named John Buck, who had traveled through the Southern Door and was living among the Cayuga. I think he died in the early 1900s. But he told one of the early ethnographers the story of how his people had basically traveled up from the south, the stops they had made along the way to take refuge among the Cayuga. And while those accounts that the ethnographer took down have now been lost to history, unfortunately, I believe that Harbinger of Spring may have been one of the refugees on this journey. There's also a really fascinating place down in eastern North Carolina. Actually, not too far from where you grew up, Kelly. I think it's Northampton County, right on the border of Northampton County and Halifax County by Roanoke Rapids.
Yeah,
or
that's
I think
really
it's near
close.
Jackson too.
Yeah, that's right over the border from where I grew up. Yeah.
And so today it's a preserve that's run by the Nature Conservancy. They call it Camassia Slopes, Camassia Slopes Preserve. And what's really unusual about this preserve is that there's a lot of Camassia psalloides growing there. Now we know this plant as camas, pretty far separated from other camas populations in the region. And so botanists have tried to figure out like why are these plants here, and they've come up with all kinds of different theories, such as the Roanoke River frequently floods its banks, and maybe the seeds wash down from somewhere in the west. I've even heard theories invoked of how these plants are a holdover from previous glaciation cycles, and I don't believe any of that. And the reason why is because where the camas is growing, it's right along the terraced hillsides going down to the swamp there, which I think is called Gumberry Swamp. And these plants are really thick. There's some other Midwestern disjuncts there too, like the name is escaping me at the moment. There's a trillium species there, and there's a blue purple flower. The name has escaped me at the moment.
Is it like a forest plant, or is it more of a prairie?
It's a forest plant.
Blue flower.
Anyway, it'll come to me. So in the ethnographic literature, there's James Mooney, who is most well known for studying the Cherokee people. In some of his posthumous writings, it was found that he documented in 1753 the Tutelo and the Saponi taking refuge from the colonizers. They took refuge in a swamp in 1753, which James Mooney placed in the vicinity of Halifax, North Carolina.
The Saponi, slightly familiar with the history of the place where I grew up. Yeah, the Occaneechi joined in with the Saponi, what was left of the Occaneechi after Bacon's Rebellion and the slaughter that happened of the Occaneechi people along the Roanoke River. They kind of joined in with the Saponi, and yeah, I've studied a little bit about that over the years, and it's really fascinating to hear more about this from you.
Yeah, for sure. So another place where camas is still found in the east is among the ancestral territory of the Catawban peoples. Mm-hmm. So this would be the areas around Charlotte, North Carolina, mm-hmm. kind of like the central North Carolina Piedmont. There's some camas around there. Another big patch is down in York County, South Carolina. But anyway, here in eastern North Carolina, in Northampton County, the camas is all around this swamp, which is exactly where James Mooney places the refuge of the Tutelo and the Saponi people in 1753. And these Siouan-speaking peoples, so Catawban is also a Siouan language, so they were closely allied with the Catawban-speaking peoples. They basically had the ancestral homeland of the Ohio River Valley, and I believe that they had camas with them, and either they took it with them as they went into refuge, or more likely they had just kept that place tended for generations, and it was just a good refuge place for them.
You broke up right after for like a few, like 30 seconds, right after you introduced the idea, or like that there's camas in this place. Is it the same species as the one in the west in the west?
No, it's Camassia psiloides, which is known as eastern camas. So here in the east, we actually have two species of camas. We've got Camassia psiloides and Camassia angusta. Mm-hmm. Angusta is mostly confined to like Illinois prairies, and it's more of a Midwestern thing. But mm-hmm. Camassia psiloides comes as far east as eastern North Carolina. I think there was some in Piedmont, Maryland, in the Baltimore area, which, interestingly, we're talking about this Siouan-speaking connection in the Baltimore Piedmont. Mm-hmm. But yeah, anyway, so the Siouan-speaking peoples came from the Ohio River Valley region, and camas and harbinger of spring can be tracked along where their ancestral lands are. There's also a lot of camas in north northwestern Georgia, especially a place called the Pocket, which is a wildflower preserve, which has a lot of disjuncts. It's got camas, it's got harbinger of spring, which isn't common in that area, and it has Claytonia caroliniana, which is more of a northern Claytonia species that isn't common in that region. And in the ledges above the gorge where all the wildflowers are, there's oaks and hickories, including hybrid chinkapins that are a cross between American chestnut and the Allegheny chinkapin.
Whoa.
And they had larger nuts. And so, I see all this evidence for basically what must have been a very intricately tended Aboriginal garden. And we use all these words like native, indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations, and wild, and all of this stuff. And I do want to be conscious of the words that I use. I'm definitely open to feedback on all of that, because in my heart I have nothing but respect for the ancestors of this place, and I feel them. I feel them in the work that I do, and that's a hard thing for me to deal with, because I know that indigenous peoples, native peoples of this continent, there's just so much grief and so much loss that they've experienced. And we all come from colonized lineages, that's for sure. But for me, I think one of the best ways, or one of the closest ways that I can tap into at least some of the grief that they must feel, is by being in these old ancestral gardens, these indigenous gardens, and doing my part to tend them and make sure that the populations are healthy, that they're strong, they're not being encroached upon by other plants. And that's really the least I can do. But I for my travels out west, it was really eye-opening to actually meet native people. And I come back here, and certainly there are native people, and I've met a few, but their absence is conspicuous here in the East.
Yeah, very much so. I feel like I've had a lot of learning to do traveling west and interacting with more indigenous peoples growing up in the Piedmont of Virginia, and like they're around, but it's just totally different. Like their presence and their identity and their cultures has a different presence on the land, and obviously due to colonization happening hundreds of years earlier on the East Coast too. A lot of, and the land is so different looking than it looked before. There's just more time, in between some of these drastic changes. So
Absolutely. I mean, I would love to see a rematriation movement, and whether that's a return of peoples to their ancestral lands, or just a closer connection between people and the ancestral plants that made them and can continue to make us in the present day. I mean, that's really important, and it's hard to know what to do. It's I definitely have a consciousness of being a white male tending indigenous gardens along a river that the native people who were involved in that for generations and possibly thousands of years no longer have access to that place.
Or even maybe the knowledge of the plants or how to approach them or any of that as well. That's like a privilege in itself, to be able to have access to that knowledge and be doing it. I grapple with that as well. Like, what is it? How to navigate that?
For sure. Yeah, it's a privilege, but it's also been a lot of work. I've come through so much research and spent so much time outside, and trying to learn this stuff firsthand. And so I really feel a strong desire in me to share what I know, and that's part of the motivation of the Nomad Seed Project. Originally, I wanted to make seeds of all of these plants accessible to most people, And on my Patreon, every time I like harvested seeds, I would send out a message and say like, hey, I've ramp seeds available or this and that. And I didn't really get many responses of people who really wanted to take on those seeds. So that kind of aspect of the project has diminished a bit, and it's turned more into almost like a strictly writing project, just getting the research articulated in a really coherent, straightforward way, getting all the references in order, and I'm really trying to just build a case. And I hate that I have to do that because it really requires me to put on like a certain hat, which is more of like an academic scholarly thing. And with all the time that I want to spend outside now that it's spring, and basically the living is easy, right? Until the fall, and even through the fall. It's hard to juggle like lived experiential reality that's primarily oral with this kind of sedentary,
academic,
highly
research.
Reflective, academic, scholarly, written
I
reality.
totally get that.
And that's a conflict in me.
It requires too. I totally get that because I've got different things in the works too, and like, and hanging out with Gabe, and he's very academic, but he's definitely a lot more like, let's just get out there, and then what I need to be able to sit down and like tap into the more academic scholarly part is like quiet, and you gotta have internet and like access to like maybe a library and like all these things, and I'm just like, sometimes I just can't. I can't. It's important too,
sure.
though. Like, it's important though to like bring together both lived experience and like glean from what is available in the records, in the historical records, and putting information together in new ways, and like then taking that back out into the field. I think all of that is really important work to be doing.
So speaking of hickories and talking about the Siouan-speaking peoples, the Tutelo and the Saponi in eastern North Carolina, right by Camassia Slopes Preserve, the next county over, but only a few miles as the crow flies, there's a disjunct population of Carya liceniosa, the shellbark hickory.
Oh, interesting.
And that's another head scratcher. It's like, why is that out there? And I've talked to some botanists about it, and basically I pitched my theory about how it was brought by the indigenous people of that region, and it was very well received. I was surprised.
Wow,
But
that's awesome.
but yeah, so another thing that I've been up to in the last couple of years, especially, is just working with these old nut groves. Now, let me think about how to explain this, but basically about 3 or 4 years ago, I was introduced through some friends to the remnants of John Hershey's farm in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. And that name might not mean much to anyone, but if you've read Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture by J. Russell Smith, John Hershey was featured in that book as basically a stellar example of what American perennial agriculture can be. And that was 1953, that revised edition was produced. So this is way before Bill Mollison or anything like that. John Hershey was growing hickory trees, walnuts, persimmons, pawpaws, plums, mulberries, hazelnuts, in an alley cropping system with corn and animals grazing underneath them. And he was doing this as early as the 40s. And he was doing biodynamic agriculture too. The thing that's interesting about this guy is that in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt asked him to head up the tree crops division of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was building the Norris Dam down in Tennessee basically during the height of the Great Depression. And so John Hershey was recommended by J. Russell Smith, who had a relationship with FDR, and they made this guy the head of the tree crops division. So John Hershey was having contests that he was sending out to all the farmers of the Southeast, basically saying, like, send me seeds of your best persimmons, of your best chestnuts, of your best hickories, of your best walnuts, and all this stuff. So he assembled some of the best tree crop germplasm in the East Coast in 1936. And he got stomach cancer and basically had to leave his directorship there. So he returned to his home in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, with all of the germplasm that he had gotten down there, and he was growing all these tree crops. So in Downingtown, unfortunately, there's a lot of development there. The city of Philadelphia is encroaching further and further east, or further and further west, I should say. And so basically, Downingtown's right on the doorstep of Philadelphia. But up until last year, there were still 90-year-old hybrid hickory trees that were 4.5 feet in diameter that had been planted in the 1920s by this guy. And the particular cultivar that these was called McAllister, which is a hybrid between pecan and shellbark hickory, and it has North America's largest native nut. So I say cultivar, but these are trees that hybridize in the wild. And then people find these trees, and then they take scionwood and they graft them and propagate them just like they were an apple or something. And so there was a 90-year-old food forest in Downingtown. So I was involved with some of the people who really closely inventoried that place, figured out what everything was, and basically rescued the germplasm, and we have it growing elsewhere because all this development is coming in and killing this stuff. So he died in 1967, but recently I found this other farm, the remnants of this other farm in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, near the banks of the Conococheque Creek. And that was the nut grove of Fayette Eder, who died in 1963. And he was a little bit, he was contemporary with John Hershey, but he was a lineman, so he was working for the power company out there, and he knew his hickories really well. So as he was out on the job working as a lineman, he would find a really good shellbark hickory tree, and then he would graft them and bring them all back to his farm. So, what's incredible is that the remnants of his farm are still there too, and there's like hundreds and hundreds of trees. Some grafted, some seedlings, and they're just dumping nuts every single season, and nobody comes and harvests them. Nobody interacts with them, and so I think about now. I know we wanted to talk about wild tending a lot in this conversation, but one of the ways this is relevant is because just whatever the perspective of these two deceased peoples were, whatever their perspective was, they did the world a tremendous service by rescuing this germplasm and giving it new life and new opportunity to cross pollinate with other trees and in basically a savanna, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's interesting about these nut crops is that in the breeder world, people are obsessed with this idea of improvement. Like, let's make the nuts bigger, let's make the shells thinner, let's make the kernels tastier, and let's make this trait true breeding, right? So we'll breed them for so many generations until that's just the way that it is. Now, with nut crops in the East, there's almost no time needed for that improvement. You start with a good parent of black walnut, and you let two good black walnuts cross pollinate, and the seedlings are going to be just as good, if not better, than the parents. And what that tells me is, or what that suggests to me, is that tree crops in the eastern United States have gone through something like a founder's effect. So after colonization came through, and a lot of our older trees were cut down, or the habitats degraded, or populations fragmented. Some of the trees continued to breed, but there was basically a change in the genetics, basically. And now that people are interested in planting these species out again, basically the genome is bouncing back very, very quickly. So I'm having trouble articulating this point exactly, but in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that I think the Native American peoples have already bred a lot of the tree crops in the East, and there was a period where they went feral. So over the last 200 or 300 years, and now that people are growing them again, they're basically returning to the way things were. So still to this day, a lot of the best cultivars that exist of hickory trees and walnut trees and persimmons they're all wild selections.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so along the Conococheague Creek, there's all these shellbark hickories, and they're amazing. I don't know if you've ever eaten a shagbark, but they're some of the best hickory nuts you can eat. They have generally small nuts, and they're generally biennial, so they produce every other year. But shellbark hickory produce every single year. They're annually bearing. The nuts are much bigger, and they're just a fantastic food crop. So they're as reliable as pecans, and we have a whole southern industry built around pecans. We could easily have a northern industry based around shellbark hickory,
Mm-hmm.
which is hardy up to like zone 4 into Canada and Maine and stuff in Vermont. So I'm not really saying like we need to be capitalists and make a new nut industry, but then again, we do need a culture change, and we do need people to prioritize bioregional foods, and that's one way that it can go. That process can happen. It's an imperfect way, but so much in our life is imperfect.
Totally.
But yeah, anyway, what?
It just, you speaking about this, about the hickory, like the evidence for indigenous peoples basically cultivating, in a way, hickory trees and other nut producing trees. It's just, it has me thinking a lot about that blurry line between wild tending and small scale agriculture, and how that play whatever we want to call what we define as small scale agriculture, maybe just selecting the best ones is all you need to call something one way or the other. I don't know. But I think that maybe that doesn't really matter actually what we call it. It's just that we engage, and that accepting and acknowledging that humans are a really important part of that engagement. And if we do continue to engage it, it's a good thing. So it just has me like thinking about a lot of that kind of thing. And also I'm curious, like, how do you feel like people could be engaging right now? Like, you do a small scale nursery where you keep some of these things and grow them a little bit, and then spread out these plants to different people, disperse these plants. um yeah, maybe just speak a little bit more about that, and maybe more about nut trees too if you want. But
Sure. I mean, I've done a lot of my own experiments. So, what I do and what works for other people are probably two different things. But I've got like what I call a burn garden. And at this point, I have a few of them. And basically, that's where I went into an area where there was already somewhat of a clearing from, let's say, a tree blows down in the forest, or, there's like some like vestigial bit of grassland there. And in the off season, just before the spring, I do a controlled burn of the area. And then um, after the burn, there's a lot of exposed soil. So it's an ideal time to scatter seeds. And so that's when I'll basically put seeds into that habitat, because they can then germinate without the competition of like being smothered by thatch and like desiccated grasses and brush and leaves and things like that. So you get better germination, you get better establishment, and then I've planted some nuts in the ground, and there's some nut bearing trees that will maybe be the future canopy of that patch. And I've moved like groundnut tubers into that space, so that at least until the canopy fills in, there will be lots of groundnuts. So I mean, basically what I'm doing is, I don't know if it could be called agriculture, but it's certainly horticulture. And I know a lot of rewilding people might be up in arms about it, but um,
well, that goes into the
it's the
conversation about
it's
what
the
is
most
wild
it's the
too.
most efficient system I've ever come across.
Hmm.
But as far as how other people can engage with this stuff, I mean, a lot of people are understandably hesitant to use fire, and I totally get that. And it would be irresponsible for me to advocate that everybody just start playing with fire. But walking with fire is a very important life way, and it's really what made us humans. As Stephen Pine, the fire historian, says, it's why we have big brains and small guts. We learn to cook food, and it's a very Promethean thing that we did too, by essentially stealing fire from the gods, by um, stealing fire, so that rather than it just being wildfire coming through from lightning strikes and things like that, it's something that we consciously create and take with us as an ecosystem tool. And so the tool of the digging stick and the use of fire, those are the two essential tools that made us human. The digging stick allowed us to live on the savannas, because we could pry our digging stick into the ground and we could pull up starchy carbohydrate roots to eat. And then our mastery of fire allowed us to cook those starches and extract more nutrients from them. And then our use of fire, we quickly learned that we could do controlled fire on the landscape, not only to prevent wildfires and like these kind of chaotic, out of control events, but also as a way to open up the ground for to spread seeds. Because like I said, when you burn that thatch away, not only do you neutralize the soil, you make calcium more bioavailable, you make the soil richer, I mean, this is how terra preta soils were created in the Amazon over generations, those rich black earths. But in that clearing where the thatch is gone, you can germinate your seeds. So two of the most revelatory books I've read lately are the Maya Forest Garden, or the Mayan Forest Garden by Ronald Ford, by Annabelle Ford and Ronald Nye. And then the other book is Cultural Forests of the Amazon by William Balliet. And what's amazing about these two books is they really kind of take that lineage of, basically, to me, they paint a very coherent picture of the deeper lineage of human beings' relationship with the land, especially in Mesoamerica. So the Mayan Forest Garden book talks about the milpa system, which in a nutshell begins with slash and burn. So the milpa workers would go into the rainforest, be it tropical or temperate, make a clearing, that's the slash, and then they would let it dry out for a season. And they would come back just before the rains or just before the spring, and they would burn it. They would burn it down to charcoal and ash, and then they would plant all of their crops, which in the traditional milpa, it's a maize-based system, but it's a multi-cropping system. So you're planting maize, beans, squash, chilies, amaranth, things like this. And of course, we have the corn, beans, and squash complex was exported to North America. So I'll get to that in a minute. But with the milpa gardening, there's been a loss of traditional ecological knowledge, especially because of the commercialization and commodification process of crops. So a lot of times in Mesoamerica today, people just refer to a milpa as any garden where they're growing corn, beans, and squash in some kind of jungle, temperate rainforest or tropical rainforest clearing. But traditionally, the milpa system only began with the maize-based multi-cropping system, but at the same time that they were planting their corn, beans, and squash, they were planting their perennial foods, the root foods, the shrubs, the perennial greens. They were planting the fruit trees, they were planting the nut trees, they were planting the nitrogen-fixing trees, they were planting the fast-growing coppiceable trees, they were planting the slow-growing canopy hardwoods, they were planting basically 80 to 120 species at one time. And basically, they were doing active reforestation in this patch that was cleared. And then they would rely on the corn, beans, and squash for 1 to 4 years. And basically that perfectly coincided with the time that it took for a clearing to grow up into a thicket scape and for canopy closure to happen. And once the canopy starts to close, you can't grow a maize-based multi-cropping system anymore. So then all of the perennials start to come online sequentially, and then 80 to 100 years in the future, you have closed canopy forest. And so William Balliet, in his book Cultural Forests of the Amazon, he does floristic studies all throughout Amazonia, and basically conservatively estimated that at least 12% of all of the Amazon rainforest is anthropogenic. Oh. And when I say anthropogenic, I mean it happened through this very process where basically slash and burn fallows or swidens, this is shifting cultivation, these became the future forests of the Amazon. And it's really brilliant, and it's really it's clever, but it's also very loving, because I realize that people's practice their shifting cultivation this way as a response to rising populations. So let's rewind the clock to 8,000 years ago. It's after the Ice Age, and in Mesoamerica and parts of South America, there are some tropical regions, but it's mostly like a temperate forest. And you have people living there already, and they're doing fire stick farming. So they're, like I talked about in the beginning, maybe they're semi-nomadic or fully nomadic, and they're digging roots and eating berries and fruits and doing controlled fire on a light scale in patches here and there. And they're kind of living in a band society, so population is low. They can always be on the move, and while they're tending the ecosystem, they're not like radically cultivating it. Now, this is a very sustainable life way, and human population begins to increase. And by about, maybe let's say 3,000 years ago, I'll just throw that number out there, the population has become pretty dense. By some estimates, almost as dense as human populations are today. And rather than people exhausting all the resources of their ecosystem through traditional ecological knowledge, they realized that they could basically do horticulture in a more and more intensive way, in a more and more complicated way. And this is where we get the traditional milpa system. So the traditional milpa allows human population to increase while reforestation increases too. So the really interesting metric that Ronald Nye and Annabelle Ford found in the Mayan Forest Garden is that as human population increased, so did biodiversity, and so did reforestation. And there's a crucial number there. You can't be cultivating more than, let's say, 20% of the ecosystem through slash and burn at any given time. You have to have a healthy balance there. But this idea has been discussed elsewhere, this shifting cultivation practice. There's another good book called Misreading the African Landscape, which focuses on West African Swidners, and basically comes to the exact same conclusion, that coupled with proper traditional ecological knowledge, increases in human population didn't mean more deforestation. They actually meant more forestation. But what's fascinating about this, especially as it relates to Eastern North America, is we had the same thing here. So when it comes to the question of were the Native Americans actively cultivating things, or was it more of a light scale, just kind of like come and go tending? At least here in the East, I fall on all the way they were cultivating, and there were some lightly tended areas too. But you have to look at the ecology here. So here in the East, we have very rich soils, we have ample rainfall, and we have high biodiversity. What that means is that we have tremendous abundance here. Out in the Great Basin and the Southwest and things like that, these are more arid environments. So it would make sense that the lifeways that would exist would be more nomadic, would be more light in their tending impacts, because basically you can't concentrate resources in a small area in a desert the same way that you can here in Appalachia, for instance. And like I mentioned, the corn, beans, and squash complex was imported into North America, possibly by a group of people known as the Miami. There's some interesting parallels with the word Miami and the word Maya, but I won't really get into that. But the word Alabama, according to a Choctaw elder, means thicket clearers. The clearers of thickets.
Wow. Interesting.
And the way this worked in North America, we can actually trace it through the anthropology and the paleo ethnobotany. I'm not aware of anybody who's put all the pieces together like I'm about to, but it's a pretty fascinating idea. So there's a girl named Natalie who's doing some work in the Midwest on the lost crops of North America. Forgive me, I forget her last name, but if you go to Google and you type in America's Lost Crops, Natalie, or something like that, you'll surely find an article about this. And basically what she's tracked is that over 1,000 years ago, there was an Eastern agricultural complex that was based on goosefoot, or like lamb's quarters, Iva Anua, which is also known as sumpweed, erect knotweed, which is Polygonum erectum. And basically what happened in the archaeological record is that these were wild plants that, as time went on, it seems like they were bred because the seeds got bigger and the seed coats got thinner. And where normally these species would be constricted to like along floodplains and like really rich fertile areas at the base of bluffs and things like that, they started to move more and more upland. And around the same time, the hemlock, pine, birch forest that dominated Kentucky was turning into oak hickory forest with persimmon and things like that around the same time. And so basically there was this Eastern agricultural complex, and it was abandoned, and it was replaced with the corn, beans, and squash complex. But what's really tantalizing to me is to think about, so we see that the oak hickory forest and the persimmons and all of that started to increase about 3,000 years ago, and they converted the forest from basically a semi-boreal hemlock, pine, birch forest to a hardwood forest. And we also see that at the same time, these annual plants, which are very nutritious, very palatable for people, loaded with protein and minerals and things like that, also seem to have been mildly bred and have increased in abundance into the upland areas where these oak hickory forests would have been emerging. Now, if we grant that this was happening at the hands of humans, we have to ask ourselves, how were they doing this and what was their process? And as I outlined with the milpa system and the shifting cultivation, there's your process right there. You know, people were they started to selectively clear certain areas, or maybe they weren't even clearing. Maybe they were just taking advantage of blowdowns. You know, trees falling down in the forest, and they were working with those spaces. They were burning them, and then they were, because they had ecological knowledge from living with these spaces for so many generations. They knew that there was going to be a process of ecological succession, and that cleared area was going to grow up first with annual plants, and then it was going to come online with different perennials, and then the trees were going to come online. So if somewhere along the line someone decided, let's start to manage these spaces in a more intentional way, they would have looked around them and thought, well, which are the plants, the annual plants around us, that deliver the most bang for the buck nutritionally? And they would have arrived at sumpweed, erect knotweed, goosefoots. And so they were gathering the seeds of these plants, and whenever there was a new clearing created by a blowdown or by a slash and burn, they would plant these annuals there so that they would have a good harvest, and they would have a lot of food that was coming out of that area. And at the same time, they were planting the oaks and the hickories and the chestnuts and the persimmons and the pawpaws and the groundnuts, you know, and all these other amazing native foods of our region. And you know, you multiply that process over several generations, and what do you see? But you see Eastern North America, which is an oak hickory forest, where there are where there are chestnuts, basically along all the slopes, along all the burnable valleys, and there are pawpaws everywhere, and there are persimmons everywhere, and groundnuts everywhere. And I mean, this is, so as far as like cultivation goes and agriculture goes, I mean, that's agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can, sometimes we can define agriculture as the diversion of waterways, and that's an interesting definition. And I believe that it does apply to a lot of what the native peoples in America were doing. I mean, that's what a lot of the earthworks were, for example, like all the mound complexes and things. But even out west in the arid west, in the Owens Valley of California, the Paiute were diverting waterways from the snowmelt in the Sierras, and they were basically creating these rock stacks that would lead through the valley, so that as that snowmelt is coming down, it would be guided between these stony paths. And with that snowmelt is a lot of alluvial soil. And as that alluvial soil is being guided down through these little irrigation ways, basically, there would be a lot of wild root foods there. And there's a Paiute elder who talks about the Owens Valley Lifeway. I think it's on the KCET Tending the Wild series on the internet. And so you can hear him talking about, what their gardens were like. So they're doing fire stick farming. They're using digging sticks. They're using fire. I mean, Shoshone means tall grass people, and it in Forgotten Fires by Omer Stewart, he basically documents all of the Aboriginal use of fire in North America. And there's so many accounts of Shoshone and Paiute people using fire. So they've got the digging stick, they've got fire, they've got waterway diversion, and active cultivation. That's all agriculture. Mm-hmm. So the question of, like, is agriculture humanity's biggest mistake? I think that question is missing something very important, and I would say that that's the reality of what propagation means. So, from my perspective, as I mentioned, I've been fortunate to learn native plant propagation through basically the horticultural trade, which, really that's a kind of traditional ecological knowledge that's been passed on to me. And the way it's informed my understanding of ecology is that I can understand a plant in its full life cycle. I can understand what conditions it needs for its seeds to germinate. I can understand when it's going to flower. I can understand what it needs for its flowers to ripen into seed. I can understand when it wakes up in the year. I can understand when it goes to sleep in the year. And, in addition to knowing how to eat it, how to prepare it, because I know that propagation information, I have a much deeper and more intimate understanding of ecology in general. Because walking into the forest, I see, well, here's this tree, and these are the conditions that the tree needs. This is how its seeds germinate, and such and such. So, it's it can be overwhelming. I mean, I can't even begin to talk about all the relations that are happening.
I think that's something missing from the whole, like, foraging wild foods and rewilding subculture that's gaining popularity now. There's like I mean, of course it's a good thing that people are becoming more acquainted with these plants, but again, the problems with the word wild that comes up too is assuming that the humans had no interaction. In some ways, that's kind of the way that we're culturally using that word, assuming that there was no human interaction with these plants, and so people are going out and foraging and not necessarily interacting with the plants in other ways, the ways that they were interacted with historically. And I think what you're illuminating here through your investigations and your work is that we need to just, like, question a little bit how we're acting in response to that. And also, it's not like there's no good or bad necessarily, no clear black and white lines of what's good and bad and how we should be acting. Well, there are some things that we shouldn't be doing, obviously, like spraying chemicals and things, but, like, I think
right.
I think that just looking deeper, yeah, and really illuminating the ways that people have historically interacted with plants is an important thing to acknowledge in a lot of ways. And then from here moving forward, like, what we can glean from that. And we're not going to be able to recreate the past, but I think uh, taking learning from the past and, like, doing what we can with what we have now moving forward is an important thing. Even though we have a lot of disjunct species populations and definitely like land that hasn't been burned in a really long time that really could benefit from it, and now we have suburbs everywhere and it's really difficult to do that. And uh, it's we can't just do that in the same way, but I think that if we if all of us like took on little projects wherever we were with what we have, I think that that really could make a difference, and not just going out and harvesting something and then not coming back until the next year when it's ready again. But having more engagement seems really important.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot to unpack in this whole conversation. Um, I really think that the word wild and the word wilderness are essentially colonial ideas, and the fact that rewilding is basically, I mean, it's literally reifying the concept of wild and wilderness, and I think that that's really problematic. So I've really stepped away from the rewilding communities in a lot of ways. I mean, I have a lot of love for what people are doing and a lot of respect for it, because I think most people who are in the rewilding community and movement have great intentions, and their aim is to um, reintegrate themselves with the foundation of all of our life, which is our Earth Mother. But I think that at a certain point, going down that path, these words can become obstacles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I think the the purpose of so basically, when I look at ecology, I don't think that there is any. It's ecology isn't a science. Ecology is happening in the present, and it's always changing. And I don't even know that there are any laws in ecology. It's basically it's all consensus driven, and our reality is built by the consensus of all the beings that are participating in it. And even with the hickory nut and its supposed like domestication, or whatever you want to call that process of breeding the nut for certain characteristics over time, that's still the dance of predator and prey. The hickory nut becomes more tasty, and the nut becomes bigger and sweeter and more nutritious, and so it makes its husks bigger and it makes its shells fatter, and it like really packs that nut inside of some packaging so that it can't be so easily accessed. And that's the dance of predator and prey. We're in this sacred symbiotic relationship with a being, and because we're in that sacred relationship, we are changed and the other being is changed too. It's that relationship changes us both. So even the idea of domestication is kind of missing the point. It's um, there's something else going on. And I really believe that in a lot of ways the earth, like as she appears to us, is something that's created in mind. It's something that's created in our thought and in our conscience. And I don't want to get too woo woo here, but it's for me it's a very real thing. And I think living so that in such a way that I'm tending some ancestral patches and that I'm tending the ecosystem and the environment, like it goes beyond subsistence. It's like, yeah, it's a very good way to subsist. I mean, I'm getting to the point with the things that I've tended that I could just completely go offline and I could live pretty well. I'd probably be pretty lonely, but like there's a lot of food out there, and if you know what you're doing and you tend it well, there's no need for starvation. And I think that's one of the crucial differences that I see between agricultural lifeways and indigenous lifeways is that indigenous people, by and large, don't seem to have the fear of starvation or the fear of scarcity. And because they know that they live in this beautiful, abundant ecosystem that can provide for all their needs, and even if it isn't an incredibly fertile place or an incredibly lush place, like even if it's an arid environment, Even the people in the Kalahari, they know, where to get marama beans. They know where to get mongongo nuts. They know where to, um, how to hunt animals. Which, by the way, when you're cultivating the landscape and you're really tending all of these foods, all the other community of all the other beings in the community of subjects are subject to that as well. And so the old swidens left over from shifting cultivation, are the best hunting grounds. And tended patches are the best place to hunt game. So, that's another dichotomy that I really would like to shatter in this discussion, is that there are two different life ways. There's the plant people and then there's the hunting people. No, it's not like that at all. They're very, very unified. And the closer you get to the plants, the closer you get to the animals, and vice versa. It's all tied together. It's all tied up. So, it's all bound. And what I was saying with, indigenous people not having that fear of scarcity, because they know their ecosystem can take care of them. They know that their mother takes care of them. They know that their mother feeds them. They live in that reciprocity, that reciprocal cycle where you receive something and you know that it's a gift, and so you give it back in return. And maybe that's the tending of that plant, maybe it's sharing it with someone else. Whatever form that reciprocity takes, it's a very real and lived life way. And so in agricultural societies, we tend to have this fear of scarcity, that there's not going to be enough, that we're going to starve, or that we're going to be poor, or we're going to be alone, or whatever. And I think it's largely because of that mindset that we store grain away in silos, or we rely um, on agriculture basically, without seeing the quote unquote wild land as supportive and warm, just in the same way as the cultivated field is. So to me, the indigenous people, they do store surplus, but they don't store it in a sack as dried food, or they don't store it as dried grain. They store it in the earth itself. Whereas agricultural people, they also store food, but because they've lost that perspective of the earth is here and the earth will take care of us, the earth loves us, they try to selfishly hoard it. And so for me, it's really just it's morality, it's ethics. And I think that a lot of this boils down to a moral decision. Are we going to share? Are we going to give? Are we going to be reciprocal? Are we going to practice symbiosis? Or are we going to be fearful? And because of that fear, we're not going to act in love. We're going to selfishly hoard.
Such interesting things to say right now in the midst of this time we're in. Um, I haven't been tuned into the news because I've been mostly off grid, but every time I come back and read what's happening with the coronavirus and the fear a lot of people have, and it's like a choice right now. We don't know what's going to happen, we don't know how it's going to pan out, but we can choose to use this as a tool, um, use this as a catalyst to question what the reality that we're all living, and not act out of a fear and hoarding mentality, but act out of like a giving and generous mentality. And I think learning from the land itself is a way to do that. It's right there in front of us.
Yeah, this coronavirus is a very, very interesting situation. I'll preface it by saying that I am skeptical of governments and will always remain skeptical of governments, but in this case, I don't believe that the quarantining is a nefarious ploy by government. I think that it's almost like the chink in the armor of the beast is its realization that it is mortal. I think that the beast, this civilized bubble that we've been living in for so long, is so numbing of our senses in so many ways. And one of the things that it's numbed is even its own sense of its own mortality. We just take it for granted that our society is right. We're going to keep on going. We're not going to collapse, and all this stuff. And what coronavirus has done is really shaken that sense up. so that it is tangibly felt by basically everybody at this point. And so the economy is shutting down and the quarantines are happening because people don't want to die, and that's on the individual level, the, that's very true. And my heart goes out to all the people who are struggling with this illness right now. But on the metaphorical level, or the societal level, or maybe we could say the spiritual level, um, this mortality that we're feeling is also the mortality of the systems that we've built around us. And we're realizing that these systems aren't going to protect us, that these systems aren't going to take care of us, and that, these systems are failing. And so I think this is a very, very important moment in our history where it's almost like we're given the choice to quit cold turkey. I went out the other night, and there wasn't a plane in the sky, there wasn't a car on the road. It was a new moon, and it was overcast, so there were no stars shining, and it was pitch black and dead silent. And in an area like this, I haven't experienced that in a long time. And it was really profound to me. And in that void space, in that silence, in that stillness, there's a lot of things that can be communicated to you. There's a lot of yourself that begins to open up and begins to be revealed. And I think a lot of people are going through that right now. And I just pray that, we don't succumb to fear and end up in a worse state than we were before. I would hope that this is an opportunity for people to open up into love and make a change in the way that we're all living globally. It's a very unique moment because of the internet and globalism, we're basically presented with this choice on a global level. Like if you look at history, like the Hittite Empire, they built cities and stuff in like Sumeria and all of that a few thousand years ago, and it seems from the archaeology that at some point those cities were just abandoned, and the peoples were like, oh, fuck this civilization stuff, we're gonna walk away and return to being nomadic hunter-gatherers. So it seems like that may have happened, but those people weren't part of a global society. They didn't get a chance to make that choice as a global community, and we have that opportunity today. I hope that I'm not like believing in a false hope, but I really feel it, and everybody I talk to, they feel something too.
Yeah, we have this technology that allows us, despite our quarantine, to be in communication with each other and to be having conversations and sharing skills and knowledge. And, that's pretty unique to anything in history. So, any other kinds of pandemic situations have happened historically and how those have affected, or other collapse type scenarios. Yeah, it's a pretty unique situation we're in right now, and it is presenting us with a choice.
Well, the collapse is also interesting from another angle related to this whole wild tending conversation, is that not only is there the collapse of societies and bureaucratic systems and organizations and things like that, but there's also collapses in knowledge. And it seems like what happened, like what's happening today, is a collapse in the traditional ecological knowledge of the Milpa system, right? So the Lacandon Maya, for example, are still practicing the traditional Mayan Milpa, which involves 80 to 120 other species at a time and is involved in actively reforesting land while earning a subsistence. But there's been a collapse in that knowledge because of commodification and commercialization of cash crops. So there are other people who are calling themselves Maya practitioners who are growing like acres of corn and acres of soy, that they've created these fields from slash and burn in the rainforest, and they're growing these cash crops and calling it milpa, but they're not acting on reciprocity. There's no plan for reforestation, and that's a really real collapse in traditional ecological knowledge, and it's something that we've gone through here on this continent. When we came from Europe as colonized peoples to this new world, there was a collapse in our traditional ecological knowledge from back home, from our homeland. And, at the same time that we're genociding Native Americans over here or pushing them away, they're going through a collapse in traditional ecological knowledge because they can't interact with their homeland anymore. They're not part of that ancestral web of relations. And so I think just returning to nature and returning to presence with her and really getting your hands dirty and trying things out and cultivating and whatever it is that really just speaks to you and teaches you the most, that's a process of building that traditional ecological knowledge back up. And when we have that traditional ecological knowledge, we can go anywhere. We can be human beings again. We've got our ecological toolkit. We've got our attitudes in balance, and we can thrive on this planet. I mean, I really think that our role as human beings is as a kind of a hyper keystone species. And what that means is that a keystone species is one where if you remove it from the ecosystem, the structure of the ecosystem begins to deteriorate or fall apart or change. So the classic example is wolves in Yellowstone. For a long time, they weren't there. They had been hunted out. And so there were all these grasslands going right down to the streams. And, because the animals would, like the elk and the bison and whatnot, would just come right down to the water's edge and drink and wouldn't have any fear because there were no wolves around. Once the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, those grasslands became thickets and willows and things like that because basically the herbivores weren't so bold in coming down to the stream. And it means that the structure of the creek and the structure of the rivers in Yellowstone actually physically changed, and they began to meander more, and their courses were altered. So that's a keystone interaction. But a hyper keystone species is the species that's deciding that certain species should be added or removed from an ecosystem. So far, over the last few hundred years, humans have been really good at removing species from an ecosystem. But it hasn't always been that way. We've been a species that's added diversity to the ecosystem through reforestation, through moving plants around, in some cases even through introducing species. And so that's our hyper keystone role, is that it's not just our absence or presence which alters the ecosystem. It's that our absence or presence alters the absence or presence of all the other beings in this ecosystem. So we have a very important role and a very, very sacred role, but it's also a lot of responsibility. And we need to step forward and basically acknowledging the responsibility that we have and start gardening for the sake of life. Start gardening for the diversity of life. I think one of the highest values that we can hold aside from reciprocity is diversity. And if you're interacting with the land in such a way that it's increasing in diversity, I think you're doing a good thing. And if you're increasing abundance, that's also a good thing. It's also diversity of another sort.
Yeah, an abundance for everyone, not just humans.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, there's so many more plants we could talk about and so many other veins that we could go on with this conversation, but I feel like maybe we should probably wrap it up for brevity's sake for folks.
Sure.
Maybe we could do another episode.
Yeah, I'm growing increasingly tongue-tied too.
I'm like, I want to hear about sunchokes, but maybe that'll be on a different episode. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah, I think we've only hit on the tip of the iceberg. That it just it's turtles all the way down, as they say.
So is there any last thoughts? I mean, in a way, you've definitely brought it to a nice spot, but if you have any last thoughts, or also how people can find you or support your work.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kelly. I think my last thought would be to encourage everybody to observe the plants that they know and love throughout the entirety of their life cycle. Um, One of the things that foraging has done well is the foraging movement has done well is introducing people to all these wonderful foods. But if you're only going out, at a certain time of year and harvesting them when they're ready, there's so much more that's happening. So I encourage everybody to just, sit with the plant and understand like when it goes to flower and like how it makes its seeds and how its seeds can be stored. Like, can they dry out or do they need to stay moist? Um, are they the kind of seeds that get scattered, to the wind, or do they just drop to the ground? And then, understand like how a plant is dormant and basically understand it in its full life cycle. I think that really opens up the world to you. Um, and it's really important with this idea of wild tending because you can't wild tend until you know how to increase the abundance of the beings that you're working with. And the way you understand that is through knowing a being in its full life cycle. As far as that about covers it. You can read some of my writings at nomadseed.com, and you can follow me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm Zach Elfers on Facebook or Woodland Rambler on Instagram.
I'm curious.
Yeah.
What are some of your unpublished pieces that you at some point will probably put out? I'm curious what plants you've been writing about.
Sure, I've got an article on toothworts. I've got one on shifting cultivation as a more of a philosophical look at that and humanity's relationship to it. I have kind of a recap of the milpa system as it relates to what was happening in eastern North America. And then I have some stuff on trees. So up till now, Nomad Seed has all been like native root plants, but I have a piece on persimmons, a piece on hickories, and I'll probably include black walnuts and butternuts and hickories all together. I'm not sure. And then yeah, that's a pretty good list for now.
Well, look forward to whenever you move through your white writer's block and you get some of those out.
Thank you.
I know, yeah, it's a process that it happens how it's supposed to happen, Yeah. Well, thanks for sitting down and sharing all this with me, and you made my job easy. I didn't really have to ask you much. You have so much to share.
Yeah, I was a bit. I hope I didn't ramble too much, but no. I was aware of how much I was talking.
Oh, it's totally fine. Yeah, and yeah, I'm gonna learn a lot from re-listening to this a few times too. And
well, thanks so much for having me. It's good to talk to you and good to talk to you again. It's been a while, so it's good to catch up.
Totally.
Hey y'all, it's Kelly. You just finished a conversation with Zach Elfers of Nomad Seed. I wanted to let y'all know that the music for this episode was called Cold Horn, and it's by Injure S, and they put out an album recently with some really cool songs on it, so I highly recommend you look it up, and I have linked the Bandcamp to that music on the show notes. You also can find in the show notes links to Zach's website where he has tons of really cool articles that he's written on his research, and his Patreon page for Nomad Seed as well, if you would like to support his project. Thanks y'all for listening so much, and take care out there.
This episode of the Groundshots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.